Here we go. Okay. All right, great. Okay, I want to welcome everyone to our monthly hot topic presentation. Those of you who have been on know that it's important to mute your computers and put your questions in the chat box and they will be answered, or any ideas that you may have or responses to the presenter. I also want to remind anyone who is a member to sign up to, as soon as you can for the annual meeting, which will take place on June 10th at 5:30 in the evening. It will last till 7. And it is primarily to elect the new board, to approve the budget, the strategic focus, and the amended bylaws, and to be present when we present the annual Molly Todd Award. So if you have not signed up, please do so as soon as possible. You've already gotten one email and you'll get another sometime in the next few days. And in addition, we have started our May membership drive. It'll extend for a few months, but the sooner the better. If you have not renewed since May of last year or have not joined before January, I believe it is, of 2020, we ask that you renew your membership for the coming year, which will run until May of 2022, which sounds very strange to say, 2022. So anyway, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to come, and I'm going to turn this over to Ethel, who will introduce our speaker. Ethel?
Thank you, Madeline. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that in July, the Hot Topics takes a break. So there will not be a Hot Topic in July. There'll be a new one starting up on August the 6th, the first Friday. And so be on the lookout for announcements about that. Our speaker today is Katie Cour. Katie serves as the president and CEO of the Nashville Public Education Foundation. She has over 20 years of experience in the education, political, and nonprofit sectors. Katie's a lifelong Nashvillian, and she is driven by the idea that Nashville should be a great city for every child and family. She's held several prior positions, including the executive director of talent strategy for Metro Schools. She was a senior consultant with Education First, which is a national education policy consulting firm. She was a senior legislative analyst at the State Controller's Office of Education Accountability, and has worked for a whole variety of education nonprofits over her career. And when she's not thinking about education, Katie loves to go hear live music with her husband, Dave, talk about world religions with her daughter, Romy, or learn the intricacies of hockey with her son, Henry, who just graduated from high school, I believe. So anyway, welcome, Katie. Good to see you again. And please take it away. It's yours. If people want to put chat, remember to mute and put your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end.
Thank you so much, Ethel. It's so good to see you. Ethel was actually my boss when I was at the comptroller's office, and she taught me a ton about how to think strategically about policy issues, how to provide strong research-based advice to policymakers, and actually was the first introduction under Ethel to the BEP. Was the first time I ever really studied the BEP and learned from her and the team. So it's great to see you, Ethel, and great to see so many people on the call that I know, and good to be with those that I don't. So I'm going to walk through a set of slides today, and I do have a decent amount of time set aside at the end for Q&A if you have that, or just a general discussion. But I also encourage you, if at any time something is not clear, or you have a question or follow-up or suggestion, just interrupt me as well as we go through these slides. So Quick agenda, as I think I also learned under Ethel, we always need to start with a very thoughtful agenda. So I'm going to provide a very quick overview of the BEP. I think we're starting probably with a pretty high level of knowledge with this group of how the BEP operates, but I want to just kind of level set on some history and some key components of it. Then I'll go into some details about how the current funding formula fails to meet Nashville students' needs. Make some suggestions on where we can go from here. And then I'm going to conclude with a little bit about how we as a foundation have thought through our budget advocacy work and make some suggestions and maybe some potential partnerships with the League of Women Voters going forward. So that's the agenda. But again, like I said, feel free to interrupt at any time. So a look back, I think most of us know that the BEP was started based on a lawsuit in the late 80s that sued the McWhorter administration. A set of small school systems in the state did that, and the BEP was the result of that lawsuit that came out in 1992. It's important that we always hear this from everyone, and my good friend Chris Henson at the district at Nashville Schools always says this: it's a funding formula, not a spending plan. So the BEP simply generates an amount that each district will be allocated, but it does not tell the district how to spend those dollars. In 1992 was actually also the origin of the term fiscal capacity. So we've talked about this a lot in our work at MPEF. What is fiscal capacity? How is it fair or unfair to different districts? And it basically has a set of formulas that determines how much a local county can afford to invest in its own education. Because Nashville is a wealthier city based on our ability to raise our own taxes and based on our own business and economic development, we have a much higher fiscal ownership than many other districts in the state. So the BEP went along for 2 decades or so, or 15 years or so, with no changes and very little adjustments to the formula at all until 2007, when Governor Bredesen introduced the BEP 2.0, which pledged almost $500 million to fully fund different parts of the BEP. Up until this point, many aspects of the BEP had not been fully funded. It gave additional direction and allocation to at-risk students. I put those in quotes because we don't use that terminology anymore. It also highlighted the need for different funding for English learner students. So it gave some improvements over the original BEP model for sure, definitely. It also introduced a new fiscal capacity model that brought with it a lot of challenges from many districts. Right after this, we thought we were going to be able to fund the BEP at a much higher, if not fully funded rate, and the Great Recession hits in 2008. And so what was supposed to be a $500 million investment ended up being about a $200 million investment. In 2015, MNPS and Shelby County joined forces to sue the state over inadequate funding, which was, of course, the opposite of the small schools back in '88, saying that they had inadequate funding. In 2016, in somewhat of an attempt to address some of the inadequacies of BEP 2.0, the Haslam administration introduced the BEP Enhancement Act, which focused on increasing teacher salaries, providing insurance for teachers for 12 months of the year instead of just 10 or 11, and then also changed the fiscal capacity model, which is honestly very confusing and is now a merging of 2 different systems to create one number for each county in the state.
What?
Is there a question there?
Yes. What did you last say?
So when in 2016, under the Haslam administration, it revised, Haslam and the legislature revised the way we calculate fiscal capacity. And so what used to just be one model to figure out how much a county can invest in its own education, it's now 2 different formulas that are combined to create the actual amount that to figure out how much each county can pony up, basically. So it's a little bit more confusing. I think the takeaway there is just that The whole fiscal capacity model, although intended correctly to try to balance out the differences in a community's ability to raise its own taxes, it's been very confusing, and it has, in the end, disadvantaged urban districts, whereas originally in our prior funding formula, it disadvantaged rural districts.
Thank you.
Interestingly, and I just think this is a really important point, this past year, we had 84 small school districts join the lawsuit with Shelby County and Metro Schools. So now we are looking at both small rural districts, medium-sized suburban districts, and urban districts coming together to apply pressure to the state in the courtroom to suggest that we're not being adequately funded. So what was once a rural versus urban scenario is now a collective of different sized districts to suggest that the funding model is really not working for anyone. So to just remind people exactly what's included in the BEP, it has 4 components, and each of these components determines how much the state will put in and how much a local district must allocate. And so the first big and by far the largest component is instructional salaries. So this is all of our teacher salaries, all of our principal salaries, all the salaries of counselors, librarians, et cetera. That's the largest component of the BEP, and certainly where the majority of local funds go as well. The second big bucket is benefits for all of those staff people. The third is classroom components that are that help reinforce instruction. So things like textbooks, technology, classroom materials, that kind of thing. And then finally is non-classroom pieces of running a school district that are necessary for efficiency and for effectiveness, but don't actually directly relate to classroom instruction, like custodial services or a superintendent's salary. This concept of fiscal capacity is really important to note as well. And like I said, the fiscal capacity is a formula that determines how much each county can afford to invest in education based on the wealth of that county. So in the state, the average state share of all funding for public education is around 66%. So if you just looked across all the counties, the state is investing about 66% of the dollars that go into public education. The local share, therefore, is about 34%. As I'll talk about in just a second, MNPS actually has a much higher fiscal burden than most counties in the state because of the wealth of our city. It's counterintuitive because we serve a very large percentage of economically disadvantaged students, but in general, the economic base of our city is quite strong, and we have an ability to raise more funds. But again, that puts an enormous onus on local urban districts to provide those dollars. So the BEP is very complicated, and it's trying to kind of resolve multiple problems, multiple topics. And we like to, at MPEF, we like to think about 2 main questions that the BEP is trying to get at. These are very complex, and it's one of the reasons why understanding the BEP gets so entangled very quickly. The first question that the BEP is trying to resolve is what it takes to run a school. So it looks across all different aspects of a school and thinks about what resources are needed to go into actually providing a good education for kids. So the resources are things like teachers, you know, as well as things like chalkboards and textbooks, et cetera. Then it determines the cost of those required resources. So how much does a teacher on average cost for a district? And then it looks at the funding ratio for each of those resources. How many textbooks should we provide per student? How many teachers should we allocate per student for any given grade? So again, lots of complicated things go into each one of these decisions, and the BEP tries to take them all and create a single number. The second big question it's trying to answer is how are funds going to be raised and directed towards education. It looks at the share of responsibility between the state and the local government. So it says, For instruction costs, the state's going to pay 70% and local governments are going to pay 30%. And then on top of that, it looks at the fiscal capacity. It identifies each county's ability to fund education based on its own tax base. So I just wanted to lay this out so that you can get a sense of all of the different aspects that the BEP is trying to accomplish and why there are probably multiple places that it's falling short, because this is a lot for one formula to try to do. Questions or thoughts there? Okay, well, let's talk about why it is failing to meet Nashville's needs. I hinted at some of this already. So the first big thing is that the formula consistently underestimates how much it takes to run a school. It does this in multiple ways. The first way is that it simply does not produce enough positions for what schools actually need to provide an education for kids. So here you'll see that this is the teachers that the BEP actually generates. So across the state, the BEP tells us that we should have roughly 65,000 teachers, 65,500 teachers. And yet districts consistently fund their schools higher than that because they know that we need more teachers to meet the needs of our kids. This is particularly acute in urban districts. And so you see this discrepancy of over 11,000 positions that are simply not funded by the state at all, that local districts must make up. And this is repeated over and over again. Assistant principals, the BEP tells us that we should have about 660 assistant principals across the state. In fact, districts fund 1,900 positions across the state. So all of those positions in excess of the 662 are funded entirely by local dollars. Again, nurses is another example. Counselors is another example. The list goes on and on. Every category practically is significantly underrepresented in the BEP for what it actually takes to educate kids. The other thing that the BEP fails to do, which results in this kind of underestimation of what it means to run a school district, is that it uses a very low teacher salary, or at least for Nashville, it uses a low teacher salary to estimate the cost of teachers. So whereas, we know by the headlines that the Nashville cost of living is significantly higher than many places in our state, if not everywhere in our state. And so to lure teachers, to attract and retain teachers, we have to pay them an appropriate salary so that they can live in our city, which is a whole nother conversation that we can have. And because of this shortfall, because the state does not allocate enough money for salaries for a city like Nashville, Nashville has to pony up $21 million annually of its own dollars just to fund those positions. And then the last thing that the BEP does is it simply doesn't provide enough funding overall. We are embarrassingly the bottom of the barrel. We're 44th, sometimes 45th in the country for per pupil spending. And we simply just don't provide enough funding to cover the needs of education. I also just want to note here that the BEP legislation in all of its different forms, in the Bredesen era in 2.0, in the Haslam Enhancement Act, uses terms like adequate, minimum, basic. I just want to, come back to this in a second, but I just want to suggest that we as a state can do a lot better than the bare minimum and the basic level. And so when you consistently are thinking about what is the absolute baseline that I can ever, provide so that somebody is getting a book in front of them or somebody has a teacher standing in front of them, that's just going to perpetuate the kind of opportunity gaps that we see across our district. Another critical piece of the BEP that we find to be very inadequate is that it doesn't adequately take into account the different needs of different types of students. Some students just cost more to educate than other students. If you have a student who is a new immigrant to our country, does not speak English yet, that student is going to cost more to educate than a student who is already fluent in English. Yet the BEP just doesn't account for that in the way it considers its formula. It does add a little bit of money for students who are economically disadvantaged. So for every economically disadvantaged student in your district, the district will receive $886 to support that student. But let's just think about that for a minute. $800 to support a student who has grown up in poverty, is living in poverty today. That is just simply inadequate under any circumstance to meet the needs of what a life in poverty is causing. The second thing that that is really not taking into account the different groups of students in our district is the percentage of student subgroups. So I want to point out that MNPS has a much higher percentage of economically disadvantaged students, of English language learners. We have roughly on par with the state average special education students. All of these students cost more to educate than other students. And so when you have not only not enough funding going into those subgroups, but also have a higher percentage of those students, it's a double whammy. And then finally, I just wanted to point out one really important program that is so inadequately funded by the BEP, and that is the Response to Instruction and Intervention, which is a legislatively required program that states provide supports, additional resources and supports for students that are behind, that are chronically behind, and then have a tiered kind of approach to how you're going to support those students to get them back on track. The BEP Review Committee, which is a group of individuals across the state who annually reflect on the needs of the BEP and how it can be improved, has said that just this program alone is underfunded by the BEP by $11.3 million. And so you have just one program as part of the BEP that is just significantly underfunded, and yet districts have to make up those funds as required by law. And then the final point here is just that, sadly to us at NPEF, and probably to many of us on the call, the BEP just simply reflects our state's priorities. And we see this in multiple ways, but we particularly see it in the way that we can see how much effort we are putting into to education in comparison to all the other things that we invest in our state. So when you look at the state investment in Tennessee in education as a percent of our total state's GDP, you see us all the way down here at the very bottom. There's only a handful of states that are below us in terms of what percentage of our total GDP we invest in education. You have these states like, Vermont up here, which is investing almost double the amount of money per student than we are as a percentage of the GDP. So let's pivot and think about where we can go from here. There are some solutions, and many of the amazing minds in our community and across the state are proposing many of these already and have been pushing for these for a long time. First thing is that I just think we all need to collectively agree we can do better than what we are doing currently. And what we've recommended, again, along with many other partner organizations, is the first thing is just to adopt the BEP Review Committee's recommendations. As I mentioned before, the BEP Review Committee is made up of representatives from across the state. We have our own Chief Financial Officer, Chris Henson in Metro, who serves on that BEP Review Committee. And they annually look at the BEP and determine where it's falling short, make recommendations to improve it. And consistently, the legislature ignores those recommendations. So for instance, one of the big recommendations this past year was to adequately fund counselors in our schools, increase the number of counselors that the BEP provides for our students. This could not be more appropriate in the year of coming out of a global pandemic, when our kids have had a very traumatic experience in public education this past year and a half, and yet we just don't have enough counselors to meet those needs. And again, the BEP Review Committee has highlighted this year after year, actually, and no action has been taken. So that is a bare minimum, is we want the legislature just to acknowledge the recommendations and reflect on changes to the BEP. But we also would like to see the entire model shift. So the BEP is a resource funding formula, which means that it takes a look at the resources that are needed, like a teacher or technology, and applies an amount to those resources to figure out how much it costs to fund education. What we'd like to see is a migration to a student-based formula where you have a base amount that every student gets. Let's say this sounds really low, but let's say it's $6,000, where every student in the whole state of Tennessee will receive at least $6,000. And then you provide weights on top of that based on the needs of each student. So you might have a weight because the student is not on grade level, or you might have a weight because the student is economically disadvantaged or a special education student. And those weights add up to a different total for each student based on the needs of each individual student. This is actually the way that Metro Nashville Public Schools allocates its dollars to the schools. And we think that that model should just be replicated at the state level. I mentioned also that we think student weights need to be different for student populations. Like I said, it just costs more to educate different types of students. And we think you need to weight funding and allocate funds more towards students who need those dollars more. And then finally, we just really believe that we just need to be putting more money into our public education system. I mean, it's at the very least, it's embarrassing. And at the very worst, it's going to lead us into an abysmal situation where we can never back out of getting our kids back on track. So if we don't correct that last piece and really think about what's important to the state of Tennessee and figure out that, actually public education needs to be prioritized just as much as many other aspects of our community, if not more, we're never going to solve this problem. So I want to just pause. I think let me just double check the chat. I saw a couple things come up. Let's see, who in state government sets things in the BEP, like the number of teachers, et cetera? Is this politicized? That is a great question. So, I actually think that what happens is the administration, and my colleague Jennifer Hill is on, she may be able to jump in and help with this question, but a government administration, for instance, under BEP Enhancement Act, developed a plan that would kind of consider how to allocate the positions, how many positions would be allocated, and then that plan goes to the state board that approves the final amount. But I'm not exactly sure, so I welcome Ethel or my colleague Jennifer if anyone wants to jump in there to confirm. And the answer is yes, it is politicized.
Yes, and those type of suggestions originate out of the BEP review committee. And actually we saw the teacher salary raised just a few weeks ago to $38,000 from $37,500. So, and then it must go through the process that Katie designed, but it generally originates through the BEP review committee, those type of adjustments.
Another question in the chat was about, thanks, Jen, I appreciate that, was about can some of the businesses moving here be galvanized to put pressure on the legislature? Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a great way that the League of Women Voters can help support the way that we promote business development in our city and state, and certainly have a say. I mean, we've seen this, with bathroom bills in North Carolina and other places that corporate entities have really been able to shift the narrative when they've galvanized support. And then Anne Marie asked about why moving to a student-based allocation is a priority. How would that be an improvement? That's a great question. I think what we have seen is that we are not creating a basic level that meets the needs of even the most rudimentary levels of funding for our city. And so we would like to just see a base amount that then really reflects on the individual needs of students on top of that amount. So it's not a cure-all, it's not like the panacea, and it's not significantly that much better than a resource system, but it would force conversations around what it takes to educate different types of students and require additional funding for those students. I wanted to just, and then I want to open up for discussion and have some kind of conversation about where we can all go from here together. But I want to talk a little bit about how the foundation, how the National Public Education Foundation has thought about its budget advocacy work, and then where we are planning on heading next, and certainly where we need support and feedback. So what we talked about, my dear friend Jen, who you just heard from a second ago, really wanted to frame all of our advocacy work in this basic question: what needs to be present in every school so that all students can thrive? And, we talk about different aspects of what needs to be in a school. You have to have an effective school leader. We know that, teachers don't leave students or schools, they leave leadership that's not strong. You have to have great teachers who are providing great instruction, but also are encouraged to collaborate and have time and resources to learn and grow. And then you need to have really welcoming and supportive cultures where not just students, but all teachers and families can go into a school building and feel included and supported. And you need students to be able to have hands-on engaging experiences in their learning that's relevant to their own lived experiences. But at the baseline, underneath all of this, the only way you can get there is by having adequate resources, enough funding, and have those funding streams aligned to the needs of students. So when we rolled out our budget advocacy work last summer, we really started kind of softly and wanted to just kind of introduce a couple of things to get conversations started. So we started by just creating an infographic that tells the different roles that are responsible for funding our schools. And so we have information about the role of the State Board of Education, the role of the Department of Education, the role of our City Council, the school board, et cetera, and how they each make decisions at different phases about the funding streams. Then we did a couple of webinars just to introduce the topic of different needs for different types of students. So we did a webinar for special education students and a webinar on English learning students. Sorry, that should say EL. We created an advocacy guide. What could you do today to help improve our schools and help increase funding for students? We presented a BEP infographic, which went through several of the points that I discussed earlier on this. And then Jen wrote this fabulous policy brief that really outlines why the BEP falls short and has really incited a lot of great conversation. We did a couple more infographics on what would it look like if a teacher was teaching in a fully funded district. How would that be different? And what would it be like for students? We helped fund a salary. We funded a salary compensation study with the mayor's office to increase teacher pay, which the mayor discussed and rolled out last month. And then we also are helping the district think about how it's going to use its massive influx of ESSER dollars. So that because of the pandemic, the district is receiving massive amounts of federal dollars, as all districts are across the country, to help with learning needs based on the pandemic. This summer, we really have two prominent goals to continue the conversation. One is to just continue to raise awareness in conversations like this about the inadequacies of our funding. And then also to actually provide specific space for some community-driven conversations and solutions about where we can go from here. I'm going to talk about one initiative in just a second, but let me look at the questions in the chat real quick, and then we'll come back to this. So Ethel wrote, given that we now have a constitutional prohibition on an income tax, do you have any ideas about how the state could raise more revenue for public education? Yes, that's heartbreaking because it's the number one way we could do it would certainly be an income tax. I'm not a tax expert, but I certainly know that we have some large tax breaks for different entities in our state. And so I think just a full reflection on the way our state has regressive taxes is a first place to start. Robert just said, don't just cut taxes. We have plenty of revenue. Robert, you want to weigh in on that? Jump on in.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, but
No, this is a discussion. I want to hear from y'all just as much.
I mean, according to somebody from the comptroller's office or former comptroller, what's the report that the annual, I'm getting the acronym, the audit, the annual audit that the state put out in January,
Yeah.
we got over $7 billion in reserves.
Yeah.
Some of that is set aside for things like TennCare, but we've never had the amount of money, not even close to the amount of money that we have in reserves. And a lot of that recently is because we've started collecting money on internet sales. Those were just lost sales that we had lost for years.
Mm-hmm.
And we have advocated for years that once you start collecting that, put it in education. And that's the low-hanging fruit right there. If just that, and I think it's going to be I think $300 million more than they estimated is going to be collected just on internet sales this year. But there are revenue streams that we're not dedicating to K-12 education that we could be.
Super helpful, Robert. Thank you. I also want to answer Ann's question about why are there some rich public schools and poor ones here in Nashville? Do they all get the same amount of money? So schools do not get the same amount of money. And in fact, schools that you might be thinking of as poor schools get more dollars than some of our wealthier schools, but because of federal funds that are going to those schools and Title I funds. But there are a significant amount of additional dollars that go to schools that happen to be in wealthier parts of our community that are from families and PTOs that are investing in those communities. So we have several schools in our district that have positions funded in their schools by their PTOs. And then we have, 40 plus schools in our district that don't even have a PTO at all. And so you see discrepancies based on what communities and families can invest in their own schools for sure. But I also really want to emphasize the point that we talked about earlier, which is that it costs different amounts to fully educate different types of students. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't acknowledge the fact that a special education student needs more resources, supports, time, teacher ratios than a student that is not in special education services. And so because of that, some of our poorer communities actually have much higher percentages of kids who cost more to educate, that come to the classroom with higher needs than what we are able to provide for them. And so that's the main reason why you see these significant discrepancies. Anne Marie just said, I'd suggest that there are no schools in MMPS who receive adequate resources. Agree 100%. So I'm gonna give you a little of this. Somebody else, one more question. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to close my chat here. Jen was saying that student-based funding provides a greater level of transparency on how we are investing in education. That's a great point. And it certainly has caused some thoughtful conversations in Nashville based on our student-based budgeting process.
Katie, I would just say, Gail Ray made a comment up there. I think you skipped just the.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I did.
That's okay. She had family moved to North Carolina who pay an education tax when they register their car based on the value of the car. That's kind of an interesting concept that I don't think we have.
Absolutely. I think that this is an untapped area and it would be great we certainly will continue to look into it, and I'll call on my friend Robert Gowan and others to help me think through solutions. But there's money out there. There's different models of how we could be thinking about using our funds differently at the state. And we really need to push on that conversation. So the last thing I want to do, and then we can just have another conversation for, 15 minutes or so about what you all want to do, or go from here, or I can leave and you all have a conversation, whatever you want to do. Is I want to tell you about a project that we're doing with the hopes of creating some community-driven conversations around why our schools are the way they are and what we can do to improve them. And that is this documentary here called By Design. We have created a documentary that chronicles the history of public schools in Nashville, starts back in the mid 1800s and brings it all the way to the present day. And it suggests that the design of our system from the very beginning was actually designed to benefit certain students over other students. And we've never corrected that error in its generic design and the way that we support and fund public schools in Nashville, in the state of Tennessee, and mostly across the country. Schools were started to support white middle-class families, and they've never really changed to adapt to the students that we have in our schools today. I'm going to share the trailer with you and then talk about the opportunities to get involved with these conversations. And then we will just kind of open it up for discussion. So bear with me for 1 minute while I get the trailer up and running. This is just a 2-minute trailer. Okay. Let's see here. All right. Let me make sure I can actually play the trailer. It's not working for me. Okay.
One of the challenges in figuring out how to talk about educational inequality in Nashville is figuring out where to start. And I would suggest that we really need to reach back quite far.
When you look at some of these early schools in the antebellum period, there was always an interest in education.
All of that was going very well until the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s. And it was during this time the inequities started to really show.
I think we will always have problems, and I think it takes collective effort to address it.
I realized that I was an undocumented student and what that could potentially mean.
There are grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the Nashville public school system today whose parents had to do the work to try to get access to education because the systems of the state tried to keep it from them.
September 9th, 1957 is one of the most significant days in Nashville history.
I thought I belonged there with all the other kids. Other people saw it different. The children haven't had words with the public about what they went through.
Some of it was hurtful, some of it was hateful. It was devastating for our parents to see.
At night, there was an explosion. We could hear it, we could feel it.
That case was the longest running school desegregation case in the nation.
They were binding together segregation in housing, segregation in schooling, and segregation in the very concepts of how people understood the city.
My memory of school really begins when busing begins for us in 3rd grade.
I mean, I'm very old-fashioned, I guess, in a way, and I just think, the secret of a successful society is just each generation is working to make things better for the next one.
I do understand that the system is resegregated. Who is going to advocate? Who is going to put that pressure? Not in a courtroom, at the table of brotherhood, that Martin Luther King talked about. That's how it's going to be done. We are truly not going to let children fail.
So I just introduced that. Obviously, that documentary is not just about funding, but it certainly has at its center the inadequate resources that we have consistently funneled towards our most disadvantaged communities, and that narrative is pulled all the way through to the present day. So we're going to be rolling that film out at the end of June. It will be publicly available later this summer, but throughout the summer, we're going to have viewing parties across the city, and encourage conversations, create different opportunities for focus groups and feedback to learn from each other and actually try to create more of a community conversation about what Nashville wants for its own schools. So I'll leave with that in mind, and then we can just kind of open it up for any questions, discussion. And then I also would just love to hear how the League of Women Voters is thinking about this topic and what you all are interested in and how you all are thinking about working on issues of public education in general. So I don't know if Ethel, you want to take the facilitator's baton, or?
I can do that. I'm not sure that I can speak really on behalf of the league, except that the league does view public education as a key component of our democracy. It's the way, unless we have informed citizens and informed voters, we can't really operate as a nation in the way we'd like to. And I think we are big supporters of public education. I guess I would just ask you, in talking about the formula, if there are other states that have a student-based formula like you are saying we should have, are there other states that you see as models that do that? I know the BEP is kind of unique here. We kind of thought it up ourselves, and probably at a time before there was as much knowledge about what other states do too, or as easily obtained information. So I would just ask you that.
Yeah, great question. So certainly when the BEP started, the majority of states used a resource allocation model, just like the BEP. So they looked at, what is the cost of a teacher, and that's how they funded their districts. We are seeing a big move right now towards student-based formulas across the state, across the country. Most states still fund with a resource model. You're seeing about, I think it's a little bit, somewhere around 20 states have moved to a student-based model. That there's very different ways of doing that student-based formulas in each of those states. And so that's an important thing to note. Of those, I think there's 5 that are actually allocating significant amounts above the base amount for weighting those students who are economically disadvantaged or special education, et cetera. So there's certainly models across the state, and I'll say that, across the country, and I'll say that many of the models are red states. This is not a blue state thing necessarily to move to a student-based formula. This is a lot of states. It's kind of a nice mix of blue and red states that we're seeing that are actually thinking differently about how to fund education. And so we certainly have a list of states that are ones that we're watching, and we are certainly watching legislation and issues across the country in terms of legal action about funding inadequacy as well.
Okay, from Anne Marie, I was very discouraged to see the state ignore this issue in a year when we have a huge budget surplus at the state level. Are there reasons to be hopeful that Tennessee will actually make any progress on investing in schools?
Oh, Anne Marie, I am with you. This is a tough time, I think, for Nashville, and I'll just be completely honest. Nashville has always been kind of the stepchild of the state, and we certainly are not in a great position right now with the state, and that's the legislature, the administration, and this is not, I'm not trying to get political here. This is simply the way that the Memphis and Nashville tend to be the stepchildren, and Nashville really is right now. And so I think that the areas that I'm seeing some hope are actually at the local level. I'm seeing some council involvement that is really promising. I'm seeing a mayor that's committed to increasing teacher pay. I'm seeing collaborations across groups of organizations that typically don't operate together, because we're all pushing in the same direction on funding reform. And so I hear you, and I get very discouraged about our state quite often. And so I'm tending to put my efforts in the local level, but I'd love to hear from Robert or others who work at the state level, your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I'll weigh in here. And first thing I wanted to say is thanks to the foundation and the league for everything that y'all did this session to advocate for more more funding. It's something that, and people that don't know, I represent the big four school systems, Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, and Knoxville, and have going back to 2009. And what you did this year, I will acknowledge, because I've been doing it this long. It's not popular. In the past, it's not been popular. I mean, and we get a lot of pushback. And I want to talk about three particular things that we hear whenever we advocate for more funding. But I will say you're not popular when you're advocating for more funding from the state in the Tennessee General Assembly. And the things that we hear back whenever we say you need to increase the amount of money you're putting in the BEP. The first, for the last several years, we put $1 billion into education in the last 10 years. Well, that's, you can almost go back any 10-year period for the last 30 years, and that's happened. That's not a significant amount of money over a long period of time. But that's the first thing that we hear over and over again. The other thing, my favorite, and Katie, you said it in your column in the Tennessean, politicians have said since 1992, we're fully funding the BEP. What they don't acknowledge is the BEP does not fully fund K-12 education. And anybody that can read the state's report card on funding can see that. You can go into the state's report card every year and see what Justin Wilson said 10 years ago. We're probably $1.5 billion, $2 billion short on what we should be putting into the BEP. The comptroller said that. The other thing, it's a new argument back to us this year. And Anne Marie, we did have high hopes that this year, because of the way revenue was coming in over projections, that this was going to be the year that there might be a groundswell. But the thing that we heard over and over again was local districts aren't spending as much money as they can on education. If you have, and this year it was directed at Knoxville, because Knoxville had a bill to help build a new baseball stadium. And the argument, and they were all on message, everybody that we talked to, if you've got enough money to build a baseball stadium, you can put more money in education. But fill in the blank, whatever a city is proposing to do next year, that's going to be another argument. But having said all of that, I'm like Katie, I do see some, I do feel a little bit more hopeful than I have. And one of the main reasons is the accolades that Mayor Cooper has gotten for his proposal to, quote, fully fund the school board's budget this year. As far as I could tell, as far as I can tell, there's not been any serious pushback and only positive response to that. So that's one reason I do feel hopeful that hopefully other politicians will see that our mayor is getting praise for investing an historic amount in education, and other politicians will take notice. And if I could, just for another minute, I said one solution is not to cut taxes. We were expecting a tax cut this year that would make the internet sales tax revenue neutral. That didn't happen. I think part of it was because the federal stimulus money complicated what states could do as far as cutting taxes if you accepted the CARES Act money. But another thing I'm really afraid of, they're going to wait for an election year next year to cut taxes. The history of the lawsuit that's been discussed, that started in 2014 with my client, the Big Four school system, sitting around a table, and they had all had the same experience with their budget preparations in 2014. And that experience was they prepared their budget to take to their county commission. Each of their county commissions said there is a lot of money that the state committed in 2017 or 2007 with BEP 2.0 that they are not, that was still the law. BEP 2.0 was never fully funded, as Katie said, because of the recession that hit in 2008. Every one of the county commissions pushed back on the school board's request for additional funds and said, you need to go to the state and get what they owe us, because the change in the formula was going to benefit the big four school systems. That same year was the year that there was proposal. It was just after the governor's race and other legislative races in 2014. That same year was the year that they had a huge tax cut. I think that year was about $500 million. I think in Bill Haslam's bio now, he has that while he was governor, that the state cut taxes by $1 billion.
I guess we have 3 minutes, and I'm going to try to work through the last 3 questions that we've got. I guess Madeline's pointed out the league does have a very active education committee if anybody wants to get involved in that. Gail Ray said she'd love to see the education attainment level of current legislators versus the years when there were successful pushes for school funding. I don't think I want to touch that one. Susan has asked, most private schools rely on donations. Is there a move to get corporate and individual donations to support metro schools? Does anybody know? Katie?
So 2 organizations exist to do that. In part, our organization, the foundation, we certainly raise a significant amount of, not a significant, but some money for the district, and do that every year. And we've been doing that for 20 years now. And then Pencil provides a lot of connections for direct corporations to funnel resources directly, and then also individuals to support the schools. You have PTOs across the district. There's always been on the table a conversation about a district-wide PTO, which would help prevent some of the inequities that we see from PTO to PTO. But obviously those local funds, and then there's individual corporations, et cetera, that partner directly with the district as well. But that level of funding cannot simply make up the difference that the BEP is shortfalling, so.
Okay, I think Elizabeth Hines has added a note that the MNPS Parent Advisory Council would be interested in joining the efforts. And I realized I think I skipped a comment up here from Jennifer Hill that student-based formulas don't necessarily guarantee appropriate effort. Would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's just underscoring Katie's previous comments, and then also attaching to a question earlier from Anne Marie, is that a student-based budget by itself, without increasing the percent of GDP that the state's investing in education, will not make a difference. It has to be a multifaceted solution in order to have student-based budget fulfill its full potential in funding education in Tennessee.
Okay. Anne Marie has asked if Katie could share the infographic that the foundation's created on what folks can do to advocate for funding.
Absolutely. I just gave the broad link to our resources page, which has all of our infographics and the BEP brief that I mentioned, as well as the advocacy guide. We call in there, it's called the Advocacy How-To Guide. And so it includes, and it's not just for funding, it talks about, teacher pay and, other things as well, but it certainly includes, it has 18 ideas that you can do today to help support thriving schools for all kids, so.
Okay, and Jamie Oakley has added her email. She is our education committee chair and for the league, and if you would like to get involved in some way through that, you can contact her. Yes, and there's the link from Katie. Anyway, I think we've reached our 1 o'clock time, so we try to be prompt here when we end. But I'd like to remind everybody this session has been recorded, and it will be on the league's website, so you can tune in there and watch it again if you'd like in a few days. And I guess I'd like to just ask everyone to give a visual applause for Katie for a great presentation. It's really, really good to have her. And I've learned a lot today about some of the BEP in the current day. I knew it several years ago, but have not been as informed as then. And I learned a lot today and look forward to seeing what happens in the next year or two. Anyway.
Thank you so much for having
everyone.
And just for being interested in the topic. It's really important that everybody help us and stay focused on this incredibly important topic. So thank you so much, everyone. It's great to be with you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.